It must have been like 5 years ago, right at this point. I was sitting in a boardroom meeting with one of my partners at Escape Climbing. And he said something at the time which it sounded profound, but then when I unpacked it, I was like, I don't think that's technically true. And I didn't really agree with it because he didn't wordsmith it perfectly. And over the years, as I've continued on my entrepreneurial journey and like more, gotten more experience, more perspective, I understand what he was trying to communicate and and how to communicate it a little bit differently. And so I want to share this with you because it's actually a really profound idea that came back to the forefront of my mind this past week at Invictus Capital. So what he said was, you can't save your way to profitability. And at the core of this, he's not technically right, because yes, you actually can save your way to profitability. And I think the reason that this didn't jive with me when he first said it was because it conflicted with one of the lessons a mentor had taught me at the very beginning of my entrepreneurial journey, which is that a dollar saved is worth more than a dollar earned. And the reason for that is just because a dollar earned is always on a margin, right? So you have your operating expenses. So if you bring in a dollar of revenue and you have, say, 50% margins, that means for every dollar of revenue you bring in, 50 cents makes it to your bottom line. But on the other hand, every dollar of expense that you can cut is a dollar that goes directly to the bottom line. So whereas, in that example, a dollar earned is only worth 50 cents, a dollar saved is worth a dollar. And so that was a message that was very important for me in understanding how critical it was to control for expenses within your businesses. My partner's insight, though, was you can't save your way to profitability. And while that's technically not true, there is a way of phrasing this that I think is dead on smack in the middle of the target, and it's super important to pay attention to. It's this: you can't save your way to abundance. And a little bit different than profitability, but you cannot save your way to abundance. And this is very important to understand in your personal finances, is that you can, if you're only making $40,000, $50,000 a year, you can at max only save $50,000 a year if you were managing to cut down all of your expenses. Now, that is still not a ton of money in the grand scheme of things, especially if you ever get sick, a loved one gets sick, or you have, you want to be able to take a vacation, go do stuff. Theoretically, you have zero expenses, so like you're living somehow magically for free. I don't know how that would be possible. But the point is, if you're only making $50,000, even if you're able to save like 80% of that, you're still, you're still not going to be able to live an abundant life. And so one of the mistakes I think personal financial gurus make when they're talking about like what you should do at the beginning of your journey, they talk a lot about saving and cutting expenses. And that is very damn true in the sense that you need to not outgrow your expenses. You need to live within your means. But in my experience, what really changed the trajectory of my financial life wasn't that I started saving more. It was that I started earning more. It was simply, instead of like, making $50,000 a year and trying to, instead of save $25,000 a year, I tried to save 30. It was much easier for me to go and make $100,000 a year. And suddenly that was another 50,000 that could go into the savings, or then make 200,000 or 300. And so because the limit, there is no limit theoretically to how much you could earn, that's exponential, whereas there is only so much you can save. And so you can't save your way to abundance. And I was thinking about this in the context of Invictus Capital because, we have roughly 30 buildings that we own and manage. And one of the buildings, this is an interesting one. We were doing our investor communications. I was working with our marketing manager to figure out the narrative that we wanted to share with our investors about one particular building where the returns came in just slightly lower than expected by a couple hundred basis points. Not a huge deal or anything, but I was helping him understand the different levers that go into that ultimate return to somebody. And as we were going through it, our expense ratio was something like 35%. But our pro forma, or our budget, the goal was like 40%. So we were actually saving even more. Like we were running more operationally lean and efficient by like 5% than we had intended. So we were saving, but we weren't in a place of abundance. And so this was the conversation we were having, is like, how is it that we are 5% under on our expenses and yet we're still not hitting the target? And the reason for that is because the revenue number wasn't where we had expected it to be. It wasn't where we wanted it to be. And so the easiest way to change all of that complexion wasn't to try and go in the next quarter and reduce our expenses from 35% down to 30%, which would be very, very difficult. Instead, it would be go and increase our revenue by 5%. That would be the easier solution. If we could do it by 10, 15, 20%, even better. And so it's so important sometimes that we do focus on the expenses, but to not get wrapped up into at the exclusion of everything else, when the reality is, in my experience, it's a lot easier. And I know this is going to sound crazy to you if you're maybe not making as much money as you want to. It is easier to increase your earning potential than it is to continually cut and starve your expense lines. Now, I'm not saying you should ignore that, but I'm just saying, like, of the two, one of them is typically easier than the other. So you cannot save your way to abundance. Hopefully this makes sense. It's a couple of competing paradoxical ideas that you have to be able to balance. It's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. You have to be able to walk in the nuance, in the gray area between the two ideals. You need to manage your expenses, which is your defense, but you also need to put points on the board, which is your offense. And truth is, defense wins championships, but only if the offense is able to put points on the board. So you got to be able to win both games. Hopefully this gives you a way of thinking about that, a new framework or a new perspective. And that's all I got. That's it. That's all. I hope this brings you guys a lot of value. As always, thank you for being here. We'll catch you in the next episode. But until then, stay hyper-focused, my friends.